to Is It Ethically Responsible to Trust AI? And presenting today, we are joined by Dr. Greg Adamson. Now, Greg works with the personal data store setup, Medikey. He has a PhD in e-business from RMIT University, a Bachelor of Technology in Engineering, and recently completed a Masters of Commercial Law at the Melbourne Law School. He is a professional ethics scholar and practitioner with a focus on intersection between technology and society. Now, before I actually hand it over to Greg, I would also like to acknowledge that we're also joined by two CPA Australia board directors, Dale Pinto and Rick DeSanti. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Now, on that note, I'm just going to go ahead and welcome Greg into the conversation, just opening up your mic. Good afternoon, Greg.
Thanks, Linda. Okay. That's a great introduction, and I think it's an interesting topic. I hope you find this presentation interesting. Just to begin with, I'm not going to be explaining a lot about the technology of artificial intelligence. So if you're looking for that, there are many guides out there. You can just Google it. However, I will be assuming that people have thought about artificial intelligence, and that's one of the questions that will be coming up in the questionnaires. So what's the challenge? Why are we worried about this? Why is this an area of concern? So ethical challenges for professionals in the accounting field are obvious. Do I fulfill my role, or do I succumb to a subtle or obvious pressure and not fulfill my role? Perhaps I steal money, perhaps I overlook evidence in an audit, perhaps I do something else. So artificial intelligence systems won't offer to bribe you or encourage you to look the other way, at least in their current versions. But they will confuse, obfuscate, and conceal. And they may do this because they're complicated, or they may do this because that's what they're trying to do, and that's what they've been told to do. So should an accounting professional take an AI's word for it? And that's really the heart of this discussion. Or alternatively, should you continue to abide by evidence-based approaches? And the field that this discussion falls into, is known as explainable AI, explainable artificial intelligence, or XAI for short. And I'll be talking about a little bit about that, where that's come from and the challenges of it. Now, I thought it would be useful to share with you the way that I've come to the area of technology ethics, because it's an important field, and it's a field that 20 years ago people weren't thinking about. So firstly, I work in a technical professional association, IEEE, and IEEE has 420,000 members across most countries in the world. And I'm on the Ethics and Member Conduct Committee body there. So of those 420,000 members, if something goes wrong, the case lands on our desk. I have an affiliation with the University of Melbourne, and with the School of Computing and Information Systems. So that's a technical aspect. I have tertiary qualifications in engineering, computer science, e-business, and law. So that gives me the technical ground on which I can look at ethical questions from multiple perspectives. I worked in banking at ANZ as an associate director responsible for operational risk in the transaction banking business unit. I have a long interest in technology philosophy. And we're formerly the president of the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology. And now my focus is cybersecurity, risk, and health technology. So all of those together frame an ability to look at ethical questions in quite a broad way. And these days one has to have breadth when one approaches questions of ethics and artificial intelligence. So there are many parts to the question, which is the topic of this talk. So does accounting care about AI? Should accountants trust technology? Is there something special about the relationship between trust and artificial intelligence? is there an expectation that we should trust artificial intelligence? That is, what do people generally do? How does this apply specifically to your profession, the accounting profession? And does it all matter? Does it matter if we're ethical or not? And I'll be considering these in turn. But before that, let's look at the first questionnaire, and I've included 3 questionnaires through the presentation. And this one relates to your current engagement with artificial intelligence systems. And so what I'd like to ask you is, are you, in your current professional role in the company you work for, or in your consulting or in your practice, do you currently use AI systems? Do you have plans to use AI systems in the near future? Are you thinking possibly about it? You have no plans, or you don't know? I ask you to vote on those in the next 20 seconds. And this will close in 10 seconds. So we then see the results. Most are in the no plans. Some are, so a third have no plans, a quarter it's under consideration, and the very few are actually currently using AI systems or have specific plans to implement them. And probably 1 in 8 of you are unclear about that. And that's a really good answer, because whether or not you're currently using these technologies, you may be using them without being aware of that. So does accounting care about AI? I've just taken a screenshot from the CPA website and a presentation on artificial intelligence and the future of accounting. And I think the description here, the podcast, explores why we should not fear AI and instead embrace the fantastic future ahead, should we choose to seize it. So I love that formulation. Yes, it's all great, but we've got to be careful, which is a really good position. I'd like to take another view of accounting and AI, and this is also still at an early stage, but it's the US Department of Treasury, which has issued an RFI currently underway. It closes on, I think, on the 1st of June, so in about a week. And the introduction, the question that they're asking is about how AI functions in relation to government and treasury purposes. And particularly, they're interested in this question of the lack of explainability and what that can mean in different circumstances. So for them, the lack of explainability can provide certain threats and certain problems. They then go on and describe an even more significant challenge, and that is AI approaches that evolve on their own. So this is an AI approach which is learning about its environment as it's performing. So you could have an AI approach which is advising on probable risks related to a particular type of audit. And as the AI undertakes these audit assisting activities, it learns further and then applies that to the future way that it addresses the assistance it provides to these audits. I'm talking about assistance here because at the moment we wouldn't allow AI to undertake an audit, partly because if something goes badly wrong, the AI can't be held responsible. But this question of the evolution of AI, or even in the extreme case, AI that is designed by AI, and in these circumstances, our level of confidence in the way the AI behaves has to be very low. Our level of confidence in our understanding has to be very low. We just don't know what's happening. So a related question, should accountants trust technology? Now, when I talk about trust to a technology audience or to a non-technology audience, when I'm speaking about technology, I always make the point that trust, there are two completely different meanings of trust, almost independent of each other. And the first of these is the trust among humans. And I've taken here a line from a poem, The Gardener by Tagore. And he says, trust love, even if it brings sorrow. Now, when I say that, you haven't read the rest of the poem, you don't know what it's about, but it evokes feeling, it evokes response, it evokes thought, it may evoke sentiment or emotion. That's what trust is when dealt with by humans, a leap of faith. I've taken a quote here from Dell, which is a computer company, and they have a thing called a Dell Trusted Device. And the Dell Trusted Device, formerly the Dell BIOS verification agent, includes BIOS verification, image capture, and BIOS events and indicators of attack. Now you can see when they're talking about BIOS, they're talking about the operating system of a computer. So you can see we're a long way away from the sorrow of love expressed in the Gardener. And this is because when we're talking about technology devices, we're talking about the weight of evidence. So a technology system will trust something if the weight of evidence indicates that it should trust it. And that could be an instruction, or it could be something more interactive. And those are very different. So I now jump to the question, which sort of breaches those two? Should accountants trust technology? So as an accountant, if you've, I remember this one case very early on, which was that if you used an Excel spreadsheet to add up numbers, the answer you got depended on whether you dragged the mouse from the last number to the first or from the first number to the last. When you're highlighting the fields to add up, the way you defined the field affected the mathematical result you got from adding the elements in the field. And that was quite a while ago, and they fixed that problem. But then about 10 or 15 years ago, there were a number of other problems related to the difficulty of adding up numbers and coming up with a whole number. So if Excel can't actually add numbers up correctly, then that's an indication that someone who uses a spreadsheet all day long should be very careful of what they're doing. Even today, when these basic problems have been solved, I would still suggest then that an auditor who used a spreadsheet which misbehaved and then claimed the spreadsheet misbehaved, it wasn't my fault, would not be considered to be an enormously competent professional. So I guess the answer there is, if you trust technology, perhaps you shouldn't. The next example I'd like to give is a more sophisticated one, and this relates to the Evidence Act. And within the Australian Evidence Act of 1995, we have an explanation that technology may be, and I've highlighted here, considered to ordinarily produce an outcome. And the example they give here, and I've put a little box around this, is that if you present evidence in court which you have photocopied, you do not need to provide a witness to testify that the photocopier has produced the document in the same order as the original document and included all of the pages. That's taken for granted. We assume it's working properly. However, that's related to a photocopier. And the examples that I'm going to talk about later relate to artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is more complicated than a photocopier. Now, when I've got here a simple example of what can go wrong with artificial intelligence. And I said I wouldn't provide a technical description of artificial intelligence, but essentially an artificial intelligence application is an application that's doing something a little bit beyond what you'd normally expect a simple spreadsheet or a word processor to do. So in this case, we had patients checking into a hospital with asthma. So this is the question of asthma and pneumonia. And the finding of the AI technology was that asthma lowers the risk of pneumonia, of fatality from pneumonia. And the way it worked out, this extraordinary conclusion was that it was trained on data from patients who entered hospital with a history of asthma, and they had pneumonia. Now, what the hospital was doing was immediately transferring these patients to their intensive care unit. As a result, the number of people with asthma who died from pneumonia was lower than the standard population. This made it less likely they were going to die than within the whole general population. However, if our learning from this pattern was that asthmatics who come to hospital with pneumonia are not likely to die, then the conclusion would be turn them away and accept patients who are more likely to die, or at least give them a lower priority. And if that happened, lots of asthmatics would be dying from pneumonia. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into the inability of an artificial intelligence system to use any common sense at all. There is no common sense in an AI system. The AI system may determine patterns, but it may make incredibly stupid conclusions from those patterns. So I want to talk a little bit about explainable AI. And before I do this, I'd like to get a little bit of information, a little bit of an idea about whether anybody here has heard of the concept of explainable AI. And the three options are: you may have read something about it or had a discussion with somebody about it, you may have heard of the term, or you may not have heard of the term. And my sense is most people won't have heard of the term, but I'd like to give you a chance to answer that. So so we have about another 10 seconds for that. And it completely doesn't matter if you haven't heard of it, because I will be describing it in a moment. Okay, so that's good. So about a fifth of the audience has had some exposure to explainable AI, and about I'm just looking at yeah, and about half haven't. Great. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this next. Now this is I've put a technical diagram on this slide, but I am not getting into technology and mathematics. But I think in this case it's useful to use a diagram for me to explain the concept of a black box. So this section of the presentation is on whether or not there's something special about trust and AI. So we've got the issue of technology, we've got the issue of trust, and today we're talking about ethics and AI. So the question of trust and AI is a very important one. Now, the term black box is universally used today. It started off in the 1940s, meaning a box was describing electronics, and it was a box which we couldn't see inside. So we didn't know what components are inside the box. And the only way we could work out anything about the black box was to put a voltage into one side in the form of a signal, and look at what came out the other end. So very, very simple concept. That's a black box. Since then, the term black box has been used to describe anything that is not knowable to a particular community. So people might talk about the international financial trades are a black box, simply because only the experts know how it works. And in that case, it's got the idea that the experts do know how it works, but the vast majority of people don't know how it works, which is a bit of a variation from the original technical approach. So with the original technical approach, the technology, the person who is using the technology doesn't know how it works. All they know is what goes in and what comes out. And what I've shown here is on the left-hand side, we have an input to the black box, which is a sine wave, and which you may remember from school. And we have an output from the black box, which is a sine wave, which is larger. And so we could say that what the black box is doing is amplifying the input sine wave. It's actually, I just realized, it's actually amplifying it in every way, not just in volume. But let's put that aside. But essentially, we could say that the black box here is behaving as an amplifier. So if we amplify, we may amplify music. For example, we may take a very quiet sound from a record, the needle on a record, and amplify it until we can hear that in a room full of people. So that's an amplifier. And the way an amplifier is designed is, there are many ways that an amplifier could be designed, but we could sort of guess from this input and this output that the content of this black box is the way we would normally design an amplifier. It would have transistors and resistors and a bunch of other things in there. So we are guessing what's inside the black box by looking at by comparing the output and the input. Now that's a good way to understand black boxes, but it has its limitations, which I'll speak about. Now, I just want to jump sideways into a short discussion of some aspects of technology philosophy. And this is I'm not going to lecture you on Kant and Aristotle, but within the technology of AI, we have this problem that some things are explainable and some things are not. Now, there's a technology called expert systems. I studied this back in the late 1970s. It's not a very good technology. It wasn't very successful broadly. It's very useful in a very narrow, limited area. And the idea was, it was supposed to be like a doctor. So you go along and you say, I have a pain in my chest, and it asks you a question: is it an acute pain is it this type of pain or that type of pain? When you press it, does this happen or that happen? How long have you had it for? So it asks a series of questions, and what it's doing is working down a tree structure, and in the end it will say, you probably have X based on the way you describe your pain. Now, in a simple case like that, it can be very valuable. If there aren't very many options, it can be highly useful. And people will be used to these tree diagrams for working out how things work. But as an artificial intelligence technology, it's not very powerful. However, it is predictable. It is deterministic. So every time you go along and you give it the same symptoms, it will follow the same route until it gets to the same solution. It's strictly cause and effect. And we know, in that case, we know why the AI provided a specific answer, as long as we know the data that went into it. Now, modern AI involves various elements. There are the algorithms, the way we approach things. There are the models, the algorithms, the way we approach in a specific sense. The models are a range of choices we can make in the way we approach things, and then the data is the information on which the artificial intelligence system is trained. And you notice here this idea of training as in you train a human, you train an animal. So the language here is very anthropomorphic, or very much reflects the idea of something that's alive. And the artificial intelligence, the term intelligence, also has this idea of something that's alive. But that is, computer systems are not alive in the normal sense of the living being that we refer. So the difficulty is with these systems, if they're not very complicated, if they're not very sophisticated, they don't provide very much value. If they are very sophisticated, then they're black boxes. And that's pretty well the way it is. And I assert that as a researcher. I have read reviews of hundreds of papers and make that assertion. And I can point to reports that also make that assertion. Other people will disagree with me. Other people will say, no, we can understand how things work. And so I just want to declare that this is the opinion that I have reached based on my research. It's not necessarily, other people will disagree with me on that. The important point to consider here is that if the person disagreeing, if the person who says, yes, we can understand things in a deterministic, predictable way, is not from a technology background, then they are relying on a technologist who's told them that. So in that case, you should ask them to refer you to the sources they're using, and then go and examine those sources. So there's an enormous amount of work in this field of explainable AI, of trying to open the black boxes. However, this is very recent. It's only in the last 5 years, since DARPA initiated a program on explainable AI in 2016, that we've seen this enormous explosion in XAI, or explainable artificial intelligence research. So the term was coined in 2004 to describe a gaming system. So it's been around for a long time, but the actual effort to explain AI is very new. It is very recent. There are, of the thousands of papers and probably dozens of fundamental approaches and hundreds of research approaches to this problem, some of them have been able to explain artificial intelligence in some cases where we couldn't previously do it. However, this is a very small proportion, and the number of unexplainable cases is increasing much more, or the number of black box cases is increasing much more quickly than the number of cases where we actually managed to open that black box. So let's just consider the challenge a little bit. What is the challenge of explaining black boxes, and what are the approaches that are taken? And this comes under the heading of, is there something special about trust and AI? Because this is not a problem that you have with another technology. Having said that, this is a problem you do have at the moment, but it's a problem you have with people. So if you're an auditor and you say to somebody, can I have the receipts for this expenditure? And the person says, I'm sorry, the dog ate them. My dog ate them. Then you have to make a decision. You have to decide whether or not the person is lying to you, or you will have mechanisms for addressing situations where there's no evidence, but you will face humans who will try to obfuscate your ability to determine the truth. in AI, we have the same problem. So if we can't, the reason we have to be able to provide some explanation for AI is that even if AI is able to drastically, and I've used the case of car accidents, even if it's able to drastically reduce the number of deaths through car crashes, if cars randomly crash and we don't have any ability to understand why they randomly crash, this is driverless cars, then we will not accept, it's a human characteristic. Humans do not want to play Russian roulette every time they get into their car, even if they know that getting into their car driven by AI is much safer than getting into the car where they're the driver and they're on a road with a whole bunch of people, some of whom are drunk, some of whom are asleep, some of whom are careless, and so forth. This is just, there's something about us where we don't like Russian roulette, unless we want a thrill, and that's a different situation. That's not what people generally want when they get in a car and have the car drive them, or when they go to a court and have a judge sentence them, or when they request an accountant to audit their books and they receive an audit result. People don't like randomness. People like certainty in those sort of situations. Now, there are many methods for explaining black boxes. One of them, the one I like best, was developed by Norbert Wiener in the early 1960s. And Norbert Wiener was the founder of cybernetics, which is the cyber in everything cyber, cyberspace, cyborgs, and so on. So he developed this system called a white box. And with the white box, you look at the behavior of the black box, the inputs and outputs of the black box, and from that, you then design a device where you know exactly how it works. You design this device to approximate the black box. And so what that means is that you can then, if it approximates the black box in 20 out of 20 cases, and you then insert case 21, then you would expect in case 21 that it will also approximate that. So you're developing a capacity to predict what the black box is going to do by designing something which is transparent to you, which is not a mystery to you. And there are other ways of doing it. There are particular cases where people say, why don't we design an AI that tells us what the critical factor was when it made a decision? An example I've seen in a couple of places is a home loan or a loan. So somebody submits a request for a loan and they get rejected. They ask why. And in the US, they're legally entitled to receive an answer. And the answer may be, you have an insufficient deposit in order to take out a home loan. If you had $50,000 more in your deposit, then we would have approved it. The difficulty with this, and some people consider this is a way of addressing the problem of explainable AI. The difficulty is that a modern artificial intelligence system of any power will be trained on millions of pieces of data. Well, depending on the AI, but there's a high likelihood that it will have an enormous range of data on which it's trained. And in those circumstances, the ability to determine exactly what factor caused the data to recognize something as a cat, or to misrecognize it as another object, is impossible for humans to understand at this stage, and in some cases may always be impossible for humans to understand. So that's so we have this problem. Now, the approach that is most commonly adopted is called post hoc explanations. And this is an almost universal approach to explaining black box behavior. And what's meant by post hoc is, and this comes out of the work of Lipton in 2016, 2017. And what Lipton proposed was that we have that there are sort of certain things such as the expert system I described before, where we can have an explanation that's understandable to humans. But in most cases, for black boxes, for all cases involving black boxes, we can only describe it based on our observation of the input and the output. Now, that may not sound very sophisticated, but that is the basis of hundreds and hundreds of various research approaches or papers currently being developed by researchers. It has some significant shortcomings. One of these, for example, is that in many circumstances, it can't distinguish between causation and correlation. So if I'm looking at the input and I'm looking at the output, I may say ice creams rise. The consumption of ice cream has risen in New York, and the number of murders has risen in New York. So I may conclude that ice cream encourages people to murder other people, whereas in fact, and that I may mistakenly think that's a causation, whereas it's actually a correlation. If in hot weather, people are more likely to murder other people due to irritability, extreme irritability. In hot weather, people are more likely to eat ice cream. So the two are correlated. One doesn't cause the other. But if I'm sort of looking at behavior and trying to guess from the behavior what happened, it's hard to work out what caused what and what was just a correlation. The explanations, post hoc explanations, are all inductive or abductive. The inductive explanation, the sun rose yesterday, it'll rise today. That's true up to a limit. In 10 billion years' time, it won't be true. At some point between now and 10 billion years' time, the sun will no longer rise. I'm obviously using a fallacious term there, but the sun will no longer appear over the horizon because the sun will no longer exist, the earth will no longer exist. Or abductive, that is the best explanation for a set of facts. Post hoc approaches describe what may have happened, not necessarily what did happen. So why am I carrying on so much about the post hoc thing? Before I come to that, this is the third questionnaire that I'd like you to have a look at. So in an earlier discussion, in an earlier questionnaire, some people, I think about 4% were actually working with AI or in the process of actively implementing AI, and the rest were unsure, or it was on the horizon, or it was only under discussion. So when you get to that point of implementing AI, an AI system, or if somebody proposes at your workplace that you implement one, how comfortable do you want to be with it before you say, yes, that's a good idea? Not at all. Basic concepts, the function, right through to subject matter expert. Okay, so let's see what people said on that. So, so once again, 4% said not familiar at all. I'm not sure if that's the same 4% who previously said they were currently engaged, or we're split somewhere else across the range. So the clear plurality there, the clear lead there is sufficiently familiar to describe its function to a client, which is a really good, I think that's a really good approach. So for example, when we get in a car, We don't have to be auto mechanics, but we do have to have a sense of why the car isn't going to simply smash into the car in front of us. We have to understand how brakes work, how an accelerator works, and things like that at a very high level of the function. So is there an expectation that we should trust AI? And this is bringing the pieces together. And I'd highly recommend that. Actually, I didn't provide a link, but you'll be able to, if you do a search on it, you'll find it very easily. It's from the Information Commissioner's Office of the UK, and it's called Explaining Decisions Made with AI. Now, the Information Commissioner's Office produces a lot of very good and interesting reports. So you might have to, so make sure you remember that this is about explaining AI. But if you remember that much, you'll find it in Google pretty well straight away. And this was last May. It's about 12 months old, but it's still it was ahead of its time, and it's still a very, very good report. I haven't seen a better report currently around yet. So it made some very astute comments, and it was not written for a technical audience. It was written for a government purchasing audience, or a government purchasing audience, and people who would like to take their best practice guide from government purchasing. And it was saying, when you're selecting AI, what do you and you're considering explainability, what do you look for? It's quite a long report. It's 50 or 60 pages. It's got a lot of detail, a lot of explanation, very readable, very, very good introduction. So the points that it makes, the first point is AI systems can make a significant contribution to society. And I think that's without a doubt. I think there's no doubt that AI can solve problems which we can't otherwise solve, and they will be useful problems. It can not only advise us on which Netflix movie to watch, maybe well or badly, but it can determine patterns which we simply can't see, which will assist in medical care, assist in human development. On the negative side, assist in identifying fraud, and generally it's a contribution to the quality of human life if used well. The second point is that the most useful AI reasoning is a black box, and it's very important that they say that, because, as I say, some people don't acknowledge that. And so the Information Commissioner's Office is a good source if you need to explain to a skeptic or no, an excessively enthusiastic person, watch out, this stuff is black box. It then makes the point, which I've been explaining over the last few slides, that most methods proposed to explain black boxes are post hoc. And which, as I've said, is an approximation of what could have happened, not necessarily a description of what did happen. And the last one there is, we expect the adoption of black box AI systems to grow. So for the Information Commissioner's Office, they do not see this as a showstopper. So that's very important. So how does this, so I'm now sort of getting to the pointy end and the conclusion. How does this apply to the accounting profession? So whether we're looking at hospital admissions, take the asthma case, the self-driving vehicles, the need for evidence of what happened, or company audits, the expectation that they'll be explainable, and hopefully that they'll be right, but absolutely that they'll be explainable. How we manage AI systems is important. Now, as I just repeated, explanations given for AI decisions are probabilities, not actual descriptions. And the example I gave from the hospital admission, the asthma one, is important. It's important to know that AI can just go off in the wrong direction. Sometimes another example that I like relates to an AI which was trying to learn how to identify horses. And it was given a large number of pictures of horses and pictures of not of horses. You know, this is a horse, this isn't a horse, and trained in this way. And what it determined was that all the pictures from the horses came from one information source of horses, pictures of horses. So what it then did, when it was asked to whether something was a horse or not, it would then look at the metadata of the photo and say, did this picture come from that database? If so, yes, this is a horse. If not, no, it's not a horse. Now, what the AI has done there is optimize a solution to a problem. So it's given a problem and it worked out a solution. It worked out an incredibly efficient solution. So it would have been able to pick, it would have been absolutely categorical in its confidence level of whether or not something was a horse. But it was completely useless. There was no value in that AI simply saying where a photo came from rather than actually determining what the photo was, the subject of the photo. So so that's a problem. So some practical suggestions, and I'd just like to work through 4 of these. If a technology provider is unable to explain to you in a way that you understand how it works, then you shouldn't adopt it. So, and there was an interesting court case here in the US a few years ago. And in that case, the seller of the solution talked about how complicated their solution was as a way to mystify with science, supposedly. And the court said, "You said this is really complicated. On that basis, we're going to reject it." So in that case was SAP, I assume they've improved their marketing since then. So if they just say it has many layers of calculation, it would be really hard to understand. Therefore, it must function well. That's a bad thing. Secondly, if the technology provider can't explain how the system's been tested for bias or arbitrary behavior, then you should also completely reject it. I'll give you an example. If imagine you have a criteria for recruiting to your company, and in the past you've always hired from a small number of elite schools, and that's the way that has been your culture. And a few years ago, you realized that was ineffective, inadequate, offensive, and unpleasant. But you take this system from a vendor, a recruitment system, which goes through and looks at all your past hiring. It looks at the most successful people you've hired in the past and applies the previous prejudice process you had, which was only to hire from the top universities or the top schools, and applies that to all the applicants. What you've got is bias. Now, you may not be aware that it's biased. It'll sort of be obvious when you look at the CVs, but at how narrow they are. But this is something you cannot learn from past experience and apply it today and expect that the result is going to meet the needs of today. That just doesn't work. So an AI that's going to replicate that past experience is not what you want. If the AI is making decisions affecting the well-being of people or the environment, these decisions should always be reviewed by a human. And when I say this is like a little bit complicated. So if I'm driving in a car and the car is deciding whether or not to brake, and if it stuffs things up, it'll kill the driver. Obviously, that has an effect on the well-being of a person, and obviously it can't be reviewed by a person in the 10,000th of a second it's got to consider whether or not to start braking. But if in a circumstance like that, after an accident, you would never trust the AI to say, I've reviewed everything that happened and I did the right thing. You would always want a human to have a look to see whether the AI's lack of common sense led to a really stupid decision, such as it was the white side of a truck and I thought, but it looked like the sky, so that's okay. Because the outcome of these things may be, we're not going to do it that way anymore. Now, if the AI system appears to be misbehaving, its use should be immediately cease. So that's the sort of, and that's not a checklist, by the way. That's just some sort of things that you should think about when you're selecting AI. And I just want to finish on last with a couple of points. Why should we care? We actually finish with one point. Why should we care? Does it matter if we're ethical or not? Now, AI systems are being sold as a magic bullet. I work primarily in cybersecurity, and in the cybersecurity space, people just say, oh, AI is going to be able to do such and such. What they fail to mention is that the attackers also have AI, and so they're going to be able to do a whole lot of more such and such. So on net, it's a complicated battle. However, so it's being sold as a magic bullet. However, technologists don't exactly know how AI works. And when I say they don't know how AI works, I don't mean they don't know how to create AI and produce something that in general will work. What I say is, in a specific case, a technologist cannot say, this is the reasoning process. I'm 100% certain this is the reasoning process by which this process happened and this decision was made. This person was employed. That person was sent to prison. At least not in the complex ones. So your obligation to your employer, to your client, to your profession, and to the public requires diligence. That's a truism. It's also a truism to say the government will regulate if a profession fails to self-regulate. However, unfortunately, you cannot wait for that. So if you wait until things go badly wrong, and then the government regulates, not only may they get the regulation wrong, but a whole lot of pain could have been experienced before that happens. And the complexity of AI systems means a significant damage could occur. And what I'm suggesting to you is that you should care, not just because it's ethical. You should care because you have a special responsibility. You have a central role. You have that insider's view that makes you the best place to look at what the AI is doing when it's applied in your environment, and to ensure that those AI systems are providing benefit and not mayhem. So with that, I'll just take you to one of my favorite quotes, once again from Norbert Wiener, where he says, his work was the foundation of factory automation and a major contributor to AI. The world of the future will be an ever more demanding struggle against the limitations of our intelligence. That's our intelligence, human intelligence, not a comfortable hammock in which we can lie down to be waited upon by our robot slaves. And with that, I'll just check for questions. Now, okay, so if people have questions, can you put them into the chat? I'm just checking it. So at the moment, I have a comment, but I don't see any questions. Linda, can you just confirm that?
Yeah, that is correct. Nobody has actually posted any questions in the chat box just yet. So we have finished up and allowed a little bit of time for questions, everyone. If you have a question that you wanted to just pop into the chat box, please feel free to do so now. Thank you.
Right. Now, somebody did put in the comment there, robo-debt. And that's a robo-debt. I don't know whether they used artificial intelligence for that or not, but that is perhaps an example that humans don't necessarily have common sense as well as computers. but in that case, a simple assumption was made of the sort that a computer could make, an AI system could make. A simple assumption was made that people were trying to get what they didn't deserve, and therefore it was okay for the government. The government was in a morally defensible position to recover what it thought was debt, and then then look for the evidence afterwards. And the government subsequently apologized deeply for that and set aside, I think it was $1.3 billion to cope with that difficulty. Okay. So thanks for the question. I had attended a seminar where there is possibility of auditors' jobs going to AI. The question would be, that's a very analytical job, how an AI would perform the job, and identify attempts to evade tax and cook the books. So I would say that just about every job in the world, including priest, is currently under investigation for whether or not it can be done by an AI. I don't think a single job would get past that. And I would also make a prediction that I think a lot of jobs which shouldn't go to AI will at least temporarily go to AI until people discover how much chaos it creates. The alternate approach is AI assisting humans, and this is sort of like the example that was given to me yesterday that University of Melbourne is working on is a robot which assists a shearer to lift a sheep in order to prevent back injury, rather than a robot which shears the sheep itself. And that's sort of like, we can think of, that's like a nice graphic example. We can think of that as, can humans and technology together identify, more effectively do a job than just humans by themselves? And if we manage that well, the answer I think would be most likely in many cases. But could the technology do it by itself? I'd be very hesitant about those audits, and I don't think they'd sort of pass the sniff test. So I hope that was a useful introduction. It may be a little bit more esoteric than you were hoping, than you were expecting. I'm hoping those 4 points I provided in one of the last slides will give you some thought and some basis. And if you want to contact me, I'm very happy for you to contact me at, I've given you my IEEE email address here. If you Google me, you'll probably get my University of Melbourne email address, but either of them is fine, and absolutely welcome queries. Back to you, Linda.
Excellent. Thank you. A big thank you there to Greg for a fantastic webinar. A special thanks to everyone for your participation as well as for your attendance today. That does formally conclude today's webinar, everyone. To exit, go ahead and click on the cross on the top right of your screen. Just letting you know, upon exiting, you will be automatically redirected to a feedback form. You are initially taken to an external Slack message. Go ahead and click the blue continue button just to go through to the feedback form. It only takes about 30 seconds to complete. However, it's really beneficial for CPA Australia as well as Greg, so please go ahead and leave us your thoughts. Just also letting you know, you will all receive a copy of today's webinar recording. It'll be emailed through to you with a copy alongside with Greg's presentation, okay? And that will be emailed through to you within the next 12 hours. Thank you once again there. Greg, as you can see, there's a few thank yous coming through in the chat box for you, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I'll pop on the music as you all exit. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you all next time. Thank you.